In the annals of medieval Europe, few executions shock the conscience as deeply as the death of a 16-year-old boy whose only crime was being born into the wrong bloodline at the wrong time. The year was 1268, and the cobblestones of Naples would soon run red with the blood of the last hope of one of history's most powerful dynasties. What happened on that October morning wasn't simply the death of a child, but the systematic destruction of everything an empire had once represented. The boy they dragged to the scaffold had golden hair that caught the morning light like spun wheat, eyes that held the weight of centuries, and hands that trembled not from fear, but from the impossible burden of carrying his family's shattered dreams. His name was Conradin, and he was the final heir to the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a bloodline that had once ruled vast territories across Europe with iron determination and divine Isafli authority. But power-eating mistress and dynasties built on conquest can crumble just as quickly as they rise. By the time Conradin drew his first breath in 1252, the empire his forefathers had forged was already bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The crown that should have been his birthright had become a curse, and every breath he took brought him closer to a fate that had been written in blood long before he was conceived. To understand the horror of what befell this child, we must first comprehend the world that shaped him. Medieval Europe was a chessboard where kings and popes moved human pieces in games of power that spanned generations. The Hohenstaufen dynasty had played this game better than most, building an empire that stretched from Germany to Sicily, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. But empires built on ambition attract enemies like corpses draw carrion birds, and the papal throne had been watching, waiting for the moment to strike. When Conradin's father, Conrad IV, died in 1254, he left behind more than just a 2-year-old heir. He bequeathed a legacy soaked in conflict, a crown disputed by enemies, and a child who would become the focal point of every political machination in Europe. The boy grew world where every smile up in a hid a dagger, every oath concealed betrayal, and every friend could become an executioner for the right price. The papal court viewed young Conradin not as a child, but as a serpent that needed crushing before it could strike. Pope Clement IV and his successor had already blessed foreign rulers as the rightful lords of territories that should have belonged to the boy by birthright. They painted him as a threat to Christendom itself, a symbol of imperial arrogance that needed to be eliminated for the good of the church and the stability of Europe. As Conradin reached his teenage years, the pressure to act became overwhelming. His advisors, men whose own fortunes depended on his success, whispered constantly in his ear about destiny and divine right. They spoke of Sicily calling for his return, of Italian nobles ready to rally to his banner, of an empire waiting to be reclaimed. What they didn't mention was that they needed his youth and royal blood to legitimize their own ambitions, and that his death might serve their purposes just as well as his victory. The decision to march south into Italy wasn't really a choice at all. To remain in exile would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his family's centuries of rule had been meaningless. So at 16, an age when most boys are learning to wield swords in practice yards, Conradin found himself preparing to lead an army against one of the most formidable military commanders of his era. Charles of Anjou was everything Conradin was not. Where the boy was inexperienced, Charles was a veteran of countless campaigns. Where Conradin commanded loyalty, born of desperation, Charles wielded armies forged by discipline and gold. Most importantly, Charles had the blessing of the church, which meant his cause was not merely political, but holy in the eyes of medieval Europe. The journey across the Alps was a nightmare of ice and death. Conradin's army was not the glittering host of his imperial ancestors, but a ragged collection of desperate men clinging to faded dreams. Storms howled through mountain passes like the voices of the damned, and avalanches claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. By the time they descended into Italy, half his forces had been claimed by the mountains, and those who remained looked more like refugees than conquerors. Yet something remarkable happened as word of his arrival spread through the Italian countryside. Peasants emerged from their hovels to catch a glimpse of the golden-haired boy who carried the blood of emperors in his veins. Old men who remembered the glory days of his grandfather Frederick II wept openly at the sight of him. Cities that had bent the knee to foreign rulers suddenly remembered older loyalties, and banners that had been hidden for years emerged from dusty storage rooms. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the impossible might happen. The boy who had been written off as a pretender began to look like a king returning to claim his throne. Italian nobles who had sworn fealty to Charles found themselves wavering as old memories stirred and ancient oaths reasserted their pull. Even Charles himself, secure in his papal blessing and military superiority, began to take the threat more seriously. The two armies finally met near Tagliacozzo on August 23rd, 1268. The morning dawned pale and sickly, as if the sun itself recoiled from the slaughter to come. Mist coiled across the battlefield, hiding the full extent of both forces and adding an otherworldly quality to the scene. On one side stood Charles with his disciplined troops, their armour gleaming, their formation perfect, their confidence born of countless victories. On the other waited Conradin's desperate host, outnumbered but fighting for something more precious than gold or land. The battle began with the fury of men who knew their lives hung in the balance. Steel rang against steel as cavalry charges shattered infantry lines, and individual acts of heroism played out against a backdrop of systematic slaughter. For a time, Conradin's forces actually seemed to gain the upper hand. The boy himself fought in the thick of the melee, his sword rising and falling with desperate precision, his presence inspiring men to fight beyond their limits. But Charles was too experienced a commander to be defeated by courage alone. He had held back his reserves, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. When Conradin's men pressed too far forward, drunk on what they thought was victory, Charles unleashed his hidden forces in a devastating flanking maneuver that turned triumph into catastrophe in a matter of minutes. The slaughter that followed was absolute. Men who had sung of empire and glory found themselves trampled into bloody mud. The golden banner of the Hohenstaufen fell, torn and stained into the mire. And somewhere in that chaos of death and despair, a 16-year-old boy realized that his dreams of reclaiming his birthright had become a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. The retreat became a rout as Conradin's shattered army dissolved into panic and terror. Knights who had sworn sacred oaths found themselves fleeing through forests thick with thorns that tore at their faces and armour. The boy king himself, his golden hair now matted with blood and sweat, spurred his horse toward what he hoped would be salvation in the dark woods beyond the battlefield. Behind him, the screams of the dying mixed with the triumphant roars of Charles's victorious soldiers, creating a symphony of horror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But escape was an illusion. The tentacles of betrayal that had strangled his dynasty for generations reached out one final time to drag him down. As Conradin sought refuge with those he believed were allies, the poison of gold proved more powerful than the bonds of loyalty. Men who should have protected him with their lives instead saw opportunity in his desperation, calculating how much Charles of Anjou might pay for the delivery of his greatest prize. The capture came not in glorious battle, but in the shadows of supposed sanctuary. Conradin was seized while believing himself among friends, his wrists bound with iron shackles that bit deep into his flesh until blood traced crimson lines down his arms. The boy who had dreamed of wearing a crown found himself wearing chains, paraded through Italian towns like a trophy of war, while crowds gathered to witness the fall of the last Hohenstaufen. Naples awaited him with all the pageantry of medieval justice, which is to say, with predetermined conclusions wrapped in legal ceremony. The city buzzed with anticipation as word spread that the pretender king would face judgment for his crimes against the rightful order. Charles of Anjou understood the power of spectacle, and he intended to make Conradin's trial a masterpiece of political theatre that would forever silence any who might challenge his authority. The dungeon where they kept the boy was a monument to human cruelty. Stone walls wept with moisture that never dried, creating patterns of mold that resembled the faces of the damned. Rats scurried through straw that reeked of the bodily functions of countless prisoners who had rotted there before him. A single torch provided the only light, its flames casting dancing shadows that transformed the cell into a vision of hell itself. In that fetid darkness, Conradin spent his final weeks contemplating the weight of destiny and the cruel mathematics of power. He was no longer the golden prince who had crossed the Alps with dreams of reclaiming his birthright. The boy in chains bore little resemblance to the heir who had once believed that royal blood and righteous cause would be enough to restore his family's glory. Yet even in that place of despair, something unbreakable remained in his spirit. The trial that followed was legal fiction performed with religious solemnity. Judges who had already decided his fate sat in robes that glittered with gold thread, while pronouncing words that carried the weight of divine authority. They called him usurper, rebel, enemy of the church, and traitor to the crown. Each accusation fell like a hammer blow, designed not to determine guilt, but to justify a conclusion that had been reached before the first witness was called. Conradin faced his accusers with dignity that unnerved even his enemies. When given the chance to speak in his own defense, he did not beg for mercy or renounce his claims. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who understood that history would judge not just his actions, but the actions of those who sat in judgment over him. His words carried the accumulated weight of generations, reminding all present that the blood they sought to spill was not merely that of a 16-year-old boy, but of a dynasty that had shaped the destiny of Europe. The verdict surprised no one who understood the political realities of the age. Death by public execution, carried out with all the ceremony that medieval law demanded for traitors of royal blood. Charles of Anjou had achieved what popes and emperors had sought for decades, the complete elimination of the Hohenstaufen threat. Yet even in that moment of triumph, some whispered that killing a boy of such tender years might create a martyrdom more dangerous than any living pretender. October 29th, 1268, dawned grey and cold over Naples, as if nature itself mourned what was about to unfold. The city's bells began tolling before sunrise, their bronze voices carrying across stone buildings and narrow streets to announce that justice would be served in the public square. Merchants abandoned their stalls, craftsmen set aside their tools, and noble ladies peered from behind silk curtains as thousands of people pressed toward the place of execution. The scaffold had been constructed with deliberate symbolism, its rough wooden planks stained dark with the blood of previous victims. The platform rose above the crowd like an altar of sacrifice, commanding attention and respect from every soul packed into that suffocating mass of humanity. At its center stood the headsman's block, worn smooth by countless necks that had rested there in final moments, while nearby waited the executioner himself, his face hidden behind a leather mask that made him appear more demon than man. The procession that brought Conradin from his cell to his death moved with the solemn pageantry of medieval ceremony. Soldiers marched in formation, their armor clanking in rhythm with their footsteps, while priests chanted prayers that seemed to hang in the cold air like incense smoke. Between them walked the boy himself, no longer in royal robes, but dressed in simple white linen that made him appear even younger than his 16 years. When the crowd first glimpsed him, a sound arose that defied easy description. Part gasp, part sigh, part moan of collective anguish, it seemed to emerge from the very soul of Naples itself. Here was no hardened criminal or grizzled warrior meeting his fate, but a child whose golden hair caught what little light filtered through the grey October sky. Even those who had come seeking entertainment found themselves moved by the sight of such youth, walking steadily towards such an awful end. The final ascent to the scaffold required every ounce of courage Conradin possessed. Each wooden step creaked under his feet like the groaning of some great beast, while the crowd pressed closer, their faces a blur of curiosity, pity, and bloodlust. The platform itself seemed to sway slightly under the weight of so much focused attention, as if the very structure questioned its role in what was about to unfold. As he reached the top, Conradin turned to face the thousands of souls who had gathered to witness his death. In that moment, the boy who had lost everything found something he had never possessed before: the absolute freedom that comes only to those who have nothing left to lose. The words he spoke would echo through centuries, transforming a political execution into something approaching the sacred. The words that left his lips were not the desperate pleas of a terrified child, but the measured pronouncement of someone who had transcended mortal fear. "Today you shed innocent blood," he declared, his voice carrying across the square with startling clarity. "But know this, the justice you deny me today will find you tomorrow." The crowd fell into absolute silence, as if even the wind itself had stopped to listen. These were not the ravings of a broken boy, but a prophecy delivered with the authority of someone who could see beyond the veil of death. What followed next would be seared into the collective memory of Naples for generations. As Conradin knelt before the executioner's block, his hands were bound behind his back with rough hemp rope that cut into his wrists until blood seeped through the fibers. The priest who administered last rites trembled so violently that he could barely complete the sacred words, his voice breaking as he attempted to offer spiritual comfort to someone who seemed to need it less than those watching from the crowd. The head efficiency, his massive man approached with practice, axe gleaming despite the overcast sky. This was a man who had ended dozens of lives, who understood the mechanics of death as thoroughly as a blacksmith understands iron. Yet even he seemed hesitant as he raised the weapon above the golden head of the boy who knelt with such dignity. The blade itself seemed to catch light from nowhere, creating an almost ethereal glow that made the entire scene appear painted rather than real. In those final moments, as the axe reached its apex and hung suspended in the grey October air, time seemed to stretch like molten metal. Every breath held, every heartbeat slowed, every eye fixed on the impossible tableau of a child facing death with more courage than most men showed facing battle. The executioner's mask concealed his expression, but witnesses later swore they saw his shoulders shake, as if wrestling with some invisible force that urged him to lower the blade and walk away. When steel finally met flesh, the sound was not the clean whistle of a sword-cutting air, but something far more visceral and terrible. Bone cracked with a noise like breaking timber, while blood erupted in a fountain that painted the scaffold planks in vivid crimson. The boy's head struck the wooden platform, with a wet thud that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the square, while his body convulsed once before falling still in a grotesque arrangement of limbs that no longer answered to any earthly command. The crowd's reaction defied every expectation Charles of Anjou had harbored about his carefully orchestrated spectacle of justice. Instead of cheers celebrating the death of a pretender, an awful wail arose from thousands of throats simultaneously. Women collapsed, men wept openly, and children who had been brought to witness the triumph of righteous authority instead saw something that would haunt their dreams for decades to come. The very stones of Naples seemed to absorb the sound of collective anguish, as if the city itself mourned the extinction of something irreplaceable. But the horror was far from finished. Medieval execution protocols demanded that the remains be displayed as a warning to any who might harbour similar ambitions. Conradin's severed head was lifted high by its golden hair, blood still dripping from the ragged neck wound, while his eyes, frozen open in death, stared sightlessly over the crowd. The executioner held this grisly trophy aloft for what seemed an eternity, turning slowly so that every person in the square could witness the final degradation of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The disposal of the body followed traditions designed to maximize humiliation even in death. Each limb was severed with methodical precision, the joints separated with cuts that revealed the terrible fragility of human anatomy. The torso, emptied of its royal wrap that quickly soaked through with the remaining blood, was wrapped in coarse bue fluids of life. These pieces of what had once been a living, breathing boy were then distributed to different locations throughout the kingdom, each fragment serving as a grotesque reminder of what befell those who challenged established authority. Charles of Anjou believed he had achieved the perfect political murder. The last legitimate heir to the Hohenstaufen claim lay dismembered and scattered, his bloodline definitively ended, his supporters left without a rallying point around which to organize future rebellions. The papal blessing that had sanctified this execution provided spiritual cover for what might otherwise have appeared as the simple murder of a child. In the cold mathematics of medieval politics, every calculation suggested that this brutal spectacle would secure Charles's position for generations to come. Yet the very excess of the execution's brutality began working against its intended purpose almost immediately. The image of a golden-haired boy facing death with supernatural dignity proved more powerful than any living pretender could have been. Within hours of the beheading, pilgrims were attempting to collect drops of Conradin's blood from the scaffold planks, treating them as sacred relics rather than evidence of justified punishment. The stones where his head had fallen were chipped away by secret admirers who smuggled these fragments to distant monasteries where they were venerated alongside the bones of martyred saints. Stories spread like wildfire through the narrow streets and countryside beyond Naples. Each retelling amplified the boy's courage while diminishing the legitimacy of his executioners. Peasants who had never heard of the Hohenstaufen dynasty began speaking Conradin's name in the same breath as legendary heroes who had died for righteous causes. His final words were memorized and repeated until they took on the quality of scripture, his dignity in death transforming him from failed pretender into something approaching the divine. The physical aftermath of the execution proved equally troubling for Charles's carefully laid plans. The scaffold itself began manifesting phenomena that defied rational explanation. Witnesses reported that the bloodstains refused to fade despite repeated scrubbing, that the wood seemed to weep crimson tears during rainstorms, and that an unnatural chill emanated from the platform even on the warmest days. These supernatural manifestations, whether real or imagined, served to reinforce the growing belief that something sacred had been violated on that October morning. More disturbing still were the reports that began filtering in from across the kingdom. Crops failed in regions where pieces of Conradin's body had been displayed. Livestock sickened and died in pastures near the sites where his severed limbs were exhibited. Wells turned bitter, wine soured in their barrels, and newborn children were marked with strange birthmarks that resembled the wounds of execution. Whether these events were coincidence, divine judgment, or the power of collective belief mattered less than their cumulative effect on popular consciousness. The clergy who had blessed the execution found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position as reports of miracles associated with Conradin's death multiplied. Blind beggars claimed their sight returned after touching stones stained with his blood. Cripples threw away their crutches after praying at sites where fragments of the scaffold had been secretly buried. Most embarrassing of all, several documented cases emerged of papal supporters experiencing visions in which the boy appeared, not as a condemned traitor, but as a crowned saint radiating divine light. Charles of Anjou's attempts to suppress these growing legends only served to amplify them further. His agents scoured the countryside for relics connected to Conradin's death, burning what they found in public ceremonies that inadvertently created more martyrs when common people died defending their sacred treasures. Proclamations forbidding the mention of the boy's name in prayers or songs were largely ignored, while punishment of violators only strengthened the perception that something holy was being persecuted by temporal authority. The political ramifications extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the execution. Italian nobles who had bent the knee to Charles began experiencing second thoughts about their allegiances. The image of a 16-year-old boy walking to his death with royal dignity served as an uncomfortable reminder of the oaths they had broken and the legitimacy they had betrayed. Revolts that might have been easily suppressed in the past now carried an additional moral weight, as rebels could claim they fought not merely for political advantage, but to avenge martyred innocents. International reactions proved equally problematic for Charles's long-term ambitions. Foreign courts that had initially supported his papal blessing began questioning the wisdom of executing a child whose only crime was claiming his birthright. The Holy Roman Emperor, despite his own conflicts with the Hohenstaufen legacy, expressed private dismay at the spectacle of royal blood being spilled with such theatrical brutality. Even allies began distancing themselves from a ruler who had demonstrated such willingness to murder children in pursuit of political goals. The psychological impact on Charles himself became apparent in the months following the execution. Court observers noted increased paranoia, sleepless nights, and a tendency to start violently at unexpected sounds. The king, who had orchestrated such a perfect political murder, found himself haunted by the very success of his endeavor. His dreams were reportedly filled with visions of golden hair and accusing eyes, while his waking hours were tormented by the growing realization that killing Conradin might have created something far more dangerous than any living pretender could have been. The transformation of Conradin from failed pretender to martyred saint accelerated with each passing season after that terrible October morning. What Charles of Anjou had intended as the final punctuation mark on Hohenstaufen ambitions instead became the opening chapter of a legend that would outlive empires. The boy's death had achieved something his life never could: the creation of a symbol so powerful that it transcended the boundaries of politics and entered the realm of the sacred. Throughout the Italian peninsula, secret shrines began appearing in the most unlikely places. Cave grottos hidden deep in mountain forests became pilgrimage destinations, where the faithful whispered prayers to the golden martyr. Ancient Roman ruins were transformed into sacred spaces where fragments of blood-stained wood were buried beneath makeshift altars. Even within the walls of established churches, priests discovered that parishioners had secretively carved Conradin's name alongside those of recognized saints, treating his execution date as a holy feast day worthy of commemoration. The underground network that preserved and spread his memory operated with the efficiency of a religious order. Merchants traveling between cities carried coded messages about miraculous healings attributed to the boy king's intercession. Troubadours composed ballads that disguised political rebellion as romantic tragedy, ensuring that his story reached even the most remote villages. Monks in scriptoriums began illuminating manuscripts with images of a golden-haired youth receiving a crown from heaven itself, transforming political defeat into spiritual triumph. These clandestine activities created a parallel authority structure that directly challenged Charles's attempts to control the narrative of his victory. Where official histories portrayed Conradin as a misguided pretender justly punished for his crimes against legitimate authority, popular memory preserved him as an innocent lamb sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. The contrast between these competing versions became so stark that they seemed to describe entirely different events, as if the execution had fractured reality itself into irreconcilable fragments. The supernatural phenomena associated with sites connected to Conradin's death began manifesting with increasing frequency and intensity. The executioner who had wielded the axe was found dead in his home just 3 months after the beheading, his body bearing no wounds, but his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The judges who had condemned the boy experienced a series of mysterious ailments that left them unable to speak, their tongues swelling until they could barely breathe. Even the soldiers who had guarded him during his final weeks reported nightmares so vivid they refused to sleep, eventually abandoning their posts rather than face another night of torment. Charles's own household began experiencing disturbances that defied rational explanation. Servants reported seeing a figure in white wandering the corridors of always his palace, glimpsed from the corner of the eye, but vanishing when observed directly. Dishes prepared for the king's table would spoil inexplicably. Wine would turn to vinegar in his cup, and his chambers would fill with the scent of death despite thorough cleaning. The royal physicians could find no medical cause for these phenomena, while priests summoned to perform exorcisms fled after experiencing visions that left them babbling incoherently about golden crowns and rivers of blood. The economic consequences of the growing Conradin cult began affecting trade routes throughout the region. Merchants reported that goods transported through areas where his relics were venerated would mysteriously multiply, while cargo that passed sites where his executioners had lived would rot or disappear entirely. These miraculous interventions in commercial activity created a shadow economy where pilgrims paid premium prices for items blessed at Conradin shrines. generating wealth that funded further expansion of his underground following. In the end, Charles of Anjou achieved exactly what he sought to avoid. By orchestrating the brutal execution of a 16-year-old boy whose only crime was his bloodline, he transformed a failed pretender into an eternal symbol of martyred innocence. The golden-haired child who walked to the scaffold with dignity beyond his years became more dangerous in death than he ever could have been in life. His blood, spilled on those October stones, watered the seeds of rebellion that would plague Charles's reign for decades to come. The horror of that morning in Naples reminds us that some victories carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and that the most brutal displays of power often reveal nothing more than the desperate weakness of those who wield it.